My fiancée laughed while her dad called me a broke leech at our engagement dinner, so I dropped the ring in her champagne and walked out. I'm 31 years old, and 3 months ago I learned that the woman I'd planned to marry and her entire family saw me as nothing more than a financial burden they were graciously allowing into their lives. My fiancée Isabella and I had been together for 2 years, and I thought I was joining a family that respected me. Instead, I discovered they'd been tolerating me while secretly hoping I'd prove myself worthy of their daughter's affection through financial success I'd never be able to achieve. Let me give you some background on how I ended up in this situation. I work as a paramedic for the city ambulance service, and I'm proud of what I do. The job doesn't pay spectacularly. I make about $52,000 a year, but it's meaningful work that saves lives and serves the community. I've been doing it for 8 years now, and I've never wanted to do anything else. Isabella and I met at a hospital where I was dropping off a patient. She worked as a nurse in the emergency department, and we started talking during one of those quiet moments between crises. She seemed different from other women I'd dated, down to earth, caring about her patients, and genuinely interested in the work rather than just collecting a paycheck until something better came along. We started dating slowly, grabbing coffee between shifts and talking about our experiences in emergency medicine. Isabella told me she'd gotten into nursing because she wanted to help people, and she seemed to respect the work I did as a paramedic. We had similar values about service and helping others, or at least I thought we did. The first red flag should have been when Isabella started talking about her family's expectations for her future. Her father, Vincent, was a successful orthopedic surgeon who owned a private practice and several medical buildings around the city. Her mother, Claudia, came from old money and had never worked a day in her life. Isabella had grown up in a world of private schools, country clubs, and European vacations. But Isabella seemed different from her privileged background. She'd chosen nursing over medical school, claiming she wanted to be hands-on with patient care rather than dealing with the business side of medicine. She drove a modest car, lived in a reasonable apartment, and never flaunted her family's wealth. I thought she'd rejected the materialistic values of her upbringing. What I didn't realize was that Isabella was playing a role, experimenting with a more authentic lifestyle, while always knowing she had her family's wealth as a safety net. She was slumming it with the working class, but she'd never actually given up her privileged worldview. The relationship progressed naturally over 18 months. We moved in together, split expenses fairly, and talked about building a life together. Isabella seemed content with our modest lifestyle, and I started believing that she genuinely loved me for who I was rather than what I could provide financially. When I proposed last year, Isabella said yes enthusiastically. I'd saved for 6 months to buy her a ring I could afford. Not the massive diamond her family's wealth could have purchased, but a beautiful stone that represented my commitment and love. She seemed genuinely happy with it and posted pictures on social media showing off her engagement with what appeared to be authentic joy. The problem started when we began planning the wedding and Isabella's family became more involved in our relationship. Vincent and Claudia had been polite but distant during the time Isabella and I were dating. They'd invited me to a few family dinners and holiday gatherings, but I'd always felt like an outsider being evaluated rather than welcomed. As wedding planning progressed, their true feelings became more apparent. Vincent would make comments about how expensive weddings were and how important it was for couples to be financially prepared for marriage. Claudia would mention friends whose daughters had married successful doctors, lawyers, and business owners, always emphasizing their impressive careers and financial achievements. Isabella started changing too. She began making comments about how we'd need to upgrade our lifestyle after marriage, talking about buying a house in an expensive neighborhood and planning vacations we couldn't afford on my salary. When I pointed out that these things were beyond our budget, she'd suggest that maybe I should consider other career options that paid better. "You're so good with people," she'd say. "Have you ever thought about sales? Or maybe going back to school for something in healthcare administration? You could make so much more money." These conversations made me uncomfortable because they suggested that Isabella wasn't actually content with our life together. She was tolerating our modest lifestyle while waiting for me to transform into someone who could provide the affluence she'd grown up with. The engagement dinner was supposed to be a celebration hosted by Vincent and Claudia at their country club. They'd invited family members, close friends, and several of Vincent's medical colleagues, about 30 people total. I'd been nervous about the event because I knew I'd be surrounded by people from Isabella's social circle, but I thought it would be an opportunity to bond with her family and feel more accepted. I should have known better when Vincent insisted on giving a speech during dinner. He stood up at the head of the table with a champagne glass in his hand, and I could immediately tell this wasn't going to be a simple toast to our happiness. "I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight to celebrate Isabella's engagement," he began. "As her father, I've always wanted the best for my daughter, and I've taught her to expect excellence in all aspects of her life." The room was quiet, everyone focused on Vincent's words. I was sitting next to Isabella, holding her hand, thinking this might actually be a moment where her father welcomed me into the family. "Isabella has always been ambitious and successful," Vincent continued. "She could have married anyone, doctors, lawyers, successful businessmen, men who could provide her with the lifestyle she deserves." I felt my stomach drop as I realized where this was heading. Instead, she's chosen to marry someone who... Vincent paused, looking directly at me with an expression that wasn't quite hostile, but wasn't friendly either. "Someone who represents different values." Isabella squeezed my hand, but when I looked at her, she was smiling and nodding along with her father's speech like this was perfectly normal. That's when I knew the evening was about to become a nightmare. Vincent continued his speech, and with each word, it became clearer that this wasn't a celebration of our engagement, but a public examination of my worthiness to marry his daughter. The 30 guests sat in uncomfortable silence as Isabella's father systematically outlined why I was an inadequate choice for his precious child. "Don't get me wrong," Vincent said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Emergency services are important. We need paramedics and firefighters and police officers. These are noble professions that serve the community." He paused to take a sip of his champagne, letting the word noble hang in the air with just enough emphasis to make it sound condescending. "But when my daughter chooses a life partner, I have to consider her future security and happiness. Isabella has been raised with certain expectations, certain standards of living that she's accustomed to." I could feel every pair of eyes in the room focused on me. Isabella's cousins, her mother's book club friends, Vincent's medical colleagues. They were all watching to see how I'd react to being publicly dissected by my future father-in-law. Isabella could live in any neighborhood, travel anywhere in the world, send her children to the finest schools. But she's choosing to limit herself to what a paramedic's salary can provide. Vincent looked around the room, making eye contact with several guests as if he was sharing a concern they all understood. "Now, I'm not saying that money is everything," he continued, though his entire speech suggested otherwise. "Character matters, of course. Work ethic matters. But let's be practical about what marriage actually requires in terms of financial stability." That's when he dropped the line that changed everything. I just hope that Isabella's choice to marry someone so far beneath her usual standards doesn't become a source of regret when reality sets in. The room went dead silent. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, not just because of what Vincent had said, but because of how casually he'd said it. Like calling me beneath his daughter's standards was just an objective observation rather than a devastating insult. But what hurt even more was Isabella's reaction. Instead of defending me or looking uncomfortable with her father's cruelty, she was smiling and nodding like he'd made perfectly reasonable points about our relationship. Vincent wasn't finished. "I've seen too many young women marry for love without considering practical realities," he said. "They think they can live on romance and good intentions, but bills don't pay themselves, and lifestyle expectations don't just disappear because you're in love." Several guests were nodding along now, apparently agreeing with Vincent's assessment of my inadequacy. I recognized the expressions on their faces, the same look people get when discussing a charity case or someone who needs help but probably won't accept it gracefully. "Isabella has expensive tastes because she's been raised with quality," Vincent continued. "She appreciates fine dining, international travel, designer clothing, cultural experiences. These aren't frivolous luxuries. They're part of who she is." I wanted to interrupt, to point out that Isabella had never mentioned caring about designer clothing or expensive dining during our 2 years together. But I was too stunned by the public humiliation to formulate a response. So when I see my daughter choosing to marry someone who can't provide these things, I have to wonder if she's really thought this through. Is she prepared to give up the lifestyle she's always known? Is she prepared to shop at discount stores and eat at chain restaurants and drive economy cars for the rest of her life? Vincent's voice carried a note of sadness, as if he was genuinely concerned about his daughter's future happiness rather than just insulting her fiancé in front of 30 witnesses. "I hope I'm wrong," he said, looking directly at me again. "I hope that Isabella's choice to marry so far below her social class works out better than these situations usually do." Below her social class. The phrase hit me like another physical blow. But I have to be honest about my concerns. When someone from Isabella's background marries someone from... Vincent paused, clearly searching for a diplomatic way to describe my inferior status. Someone from a more limited background. There are usually conflicts about money, lifestyle, and expectations. That's when Isabella finally spoke up, but not to defend me. "Daddy, I think you're being a little harsh," she said with a laugh that made my blood run cold. "Walker isn't that bad with money. He's just not used to thinking about long-term financial planning the way we are. Not that bad with money. Like I was a child who needed guidance rather than a grown man who'd been managing his own finances for over a decade. I'm sure we can work through any differences," Isabella continued, still smiling. "Walker is learning about how our family approaches these things. Learning. Like I was a student being taught proper behavior by my social superiors." The conversation continued around me as guests began offering their own thoughts about cross-class marriages and the challenges they presented. I sat there listening to 30 people discuss my relationship like I wasn't present, analyzing my suitability as a husband like I was a job candidate being evaluated for a position I probably wasn't qualified for. Isabella participated enthusiastically in these discussions, agreeing with points about the importance of financial compatibility and nodding when people mentioned successful marriages between partners from similar backgrounds. She never once defended my character, my career, or my worthiness as her partner. That's when I realized that Isabella hadn't just tolerated her father's speech, she'd agreed with it. She saw me exactly the way he did, as someone beneath her standards who she was graciously allowing into her life despite my obvious inadequacies. I looked around the room at 30 people who'd spent the evening discussing my inferiority while I sat there like a specimen in a jar. Then I looked at Isabella, who was still smiling and participating in conversations about my shortcomings like this was perfectly normal behavior. That's when I stood up, picked up Isabella's champagne glass, and did something that ended our engagement in the most memorable way possible. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the country club's marble floor loud enough that several conversations stopped mid-sentence. Isabella looked up at me with mild curiosity, probably expecting me to excuse myself to use the restroom or step outside for some air after the emotional beating I'd just endured. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the engagement ring she'd given back to me earlier that week for cleaning. I'd been planning to surprise her by having it professionally polished for our engagement photos, but now it was going to serve a very different purpose. "Isabella," I said, my voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I need to return something that belongs to you." The room went completely silent. Even the servers stopped moving, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Isabella's smile faltered slightly as she realized I was holding her engagement ring. "Walker, what are you doing?" I looked around the room at the 30 people who'd spent the evening discussing my inadequacies like I was a charity case they were all trying to figure out how to help. Vincent was still standing at the head of the table, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. "I've been sitting here listening to your father explain why I'm not good enough for you," I said, keeping my voice level and clear so everyone could hear. "And I've been watching you agree with every word he's said." "Walker, please don't make a scene," Isabella whispered, but her voice carried in the silent room. "A scene?" I asked. "Your father just spent 20 minutes explaining to 30 people why I'm beneath your social class, why my career is inadequate, and why you're making a mistake by marrying me. And you sat there laughing and agreeing with him." Isabella's face flushed red. It wasn't like that. Daddy was just expressing some concerns about our future. He called me a broke leech who was beneath your standards," I said bluntly. "And you laughed." The accuracy of that summary seemed to hit several guests uncomfortably. Vincent started to speak, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I'm not finished," I said. "See, Vincent, you're absolutely right about one thing. Isabella and I are from different social classes, but you're wrong about which one of us should be embarrassed by that." I turned to look directly at Isabella, who was staring at me with growing alarm. For 2 years, I thought I was dating someone who cared about helping people and making a difference in the world. Someone who chose nursing because she wanted to serve others, not because she was killing time until she found a rich husband. "That's not fair," Isabella protested. "What's not fair?" I continued. "Is sitting here listening to your father insult my character and my career while you nod along like he's making reasonable points. What's not fair is discovering that the woman I wanted to marry sees me exactly the way her family does, as someone who isn't good enough." I held up the engagement ring so everyone in the room could see it clearly. You want to know the difference between your social class and mine? In my social class, we don't invite someone to dinner just to humiliate them in front of 30 witnesses. In my social class, we don't measure someone's worth by their bank account or their ability to buy expensive things. Vincent finally found his voice. Now see here, young man. No, you see here. I interrupted, my patience finally exhausted. I work as a paramedic because I believe in helping people when they're having the worst days of their lives. I've saved lives, comforted families, and made a difference in my community every single day for 8 years. I looked around the room at the faces staring back at me, some uncomfortable, some curious, some openly hostile. I make $52,000 a year, which apparently makes me a broke leech in your social circle. But you know what? I've never once in my life invited someone to my home just to insult them. I've never measured someone's worth by their ability to shop at expensive stores or eat at fancy restaurants. Isabella was crying now, but I could tell they were tears of embarrassment rather than sadness. Walker, please, she said. Let's talk about this privately. No, I said firmly. Your father made sure this conversation happened publicly, so my response is going to be public too. I walked over to Isabella's place setting, where her champagne glass sat half full beside her dinner plate. You want someone who can provide you with the lifestyle you're accustomed to, I said. Someone from your social class who understands your family's values and can give you the material things you apparently need to be happy. I held the engagement ring directly over her champagne glass. Well, Isabella, you're free to find that person. Because I'm not going to spend the rest of my life trying to prove I'm worthy of someone who fundamentally doesn't respect what I do or who I am. Isabella reached out toward the ring. Walker, don't. I dropped the ring into her champagne glass, where it landed with a small splash and sank to the bottom among the bubbles. Consider this my resignation from the position of trying to meet your family's standards, I said. The room was so quiet I could hear the country club's grandfather clock ticking in the lobby. 30 people sat frozen, staring at the engagement ring sitting in the bottom of Isabella's champagne glass, like it was the most shocking thing they'd ever witnessed. I pulled out my wallet and placed a $50 bill on the table next to my untouched dinner plate. That should cover my portion of tonight's meal, I said. Thank you for the educational experience about your family's values. Then I walked out of that country club with my dignity intact and my future wide open, leaving behind a room full of people who'd just learned that sometimes the person you're looking down on is actually looking down on you. I walked out of that country club and drove straight home, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but my mind clearer than it had been in months. For the first time since Isabella and I had started planning our wedding, I felt like I could breathe properly. The suffocating weight of trying to prove myself worthy of her family's approval was gone, replaced by the liberating realization that their approval wasn't something I wanted anymore. My phone started buzzing before I even made it home. Text messages from Isabella, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and voicemails that I had no intention of listening to. I turned off my phone and spent the evening sitting on my couch, thinking about how completely I'd misjudged the woman I'd planned to marry. The next morning, I found 17 missed calls from Isabella and a series of increasingly frantic text messages that showed me exactly how little she understood about what had happened at dinner. Walker, I can't believe you embarrassed me like that in front of my entire family, one message read. We need to talk about this like adults. Another message said, I know Daddy was a little harsh, but you completely overreacted. We can work through this if you just apologize and we can move past it. The most revealing message came at 2 a.m. I told everyone you were having work stress, and that's why you acted so strangely. We can fix this, but you need to call me back immediately. Work stress. Isabella was telling people that my reaction to being publicly humiliated was due to job-related pressure rather than acknowledging that her family had treated me despicably. She was still protecting their reputation while dismissing my legitimate response to their cruelty. I finally turned my phone back on and called Isabella that afternoon, not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I needed to make sure she understood that our relationship was permanently over. Walker, thank God, she said when she answered. I've been worried sick. Where have you been? I've been thinking about what happened last night, I said calmly. And I need you to understand that we're done. Permanently. Don't be ridiculous, Isabella said, her voice taking on the same dismissive tone she'd used at dinner. You're upset because Daddy was protective of me, but that's what fathers do. We can work through this. Your father called me a broke leech who was beneath your social class, I said, and you laughed along with him. There's nothing to work through. He never used those words, Isabella protested, though we both knew the meaning had been clear regardless of the specific language. Isabella, you sat there while your father spent 20 minutes explaining to 30 people why I wasn't good enough for you. You participated in conversations about my inadequacies like I wasn't even present. You agreed when people said cross-class marriages usually fail. There was a long pause before Isabella spoke again, and when she did, her tone had shifted to something colder. Maybe if you'd actually tried to fit in with my family instead of being so defensive about your limitations, this wouldn't have happened. My limitations. Even now, after everything that had occurred, Isabella couldn't understand that the problem wasn't my career or income. It was her family's values and her agreement with them. You're right, I said. I do have limitations. I'm limited by having principles. I'm limited by believing that someone's worth isn't measured by their bank account. I'm limited by thinking that the person I marry should respect and support my career instead of seeing it as something I need to overcome. You're being dramatic, Isabella said. All families have expectations for their children's spouses. That's normal. No, Isabella. Normal families don't invite their daughter's fiancé to dinner just to publicly humiliate him. Normal families don't discuss someone's inadequacies while he's sitting right there. Normal families show basic respect for people their children choose to love. I could hear Isabella crying, but I knew they were still tears of frustration rather than genuine remorse. I can't believe you're throwing away everything we built together over one difficult conversation, she said. I'm not throwing anything away, I replied. I'm acknowledging that what I thought we'd built together never actually existed. You've been tolerating our relationship while waiting for me to become someone else. Someone wealthier, someone from your social class, someone your family could approve of. The conversation continued for another few minutes, but it was clear that Isabella couldn't understand why her family's behavior had been unacceptable. In her world, evaluating someone's financial worthiness was normal and reasonable. The idea that I might have value beyond my earning potential was genuinely foreign to her. 3 weeks later, I heard through mutual friends that Isabella had started dating a cardiologist from her father's hospital. According to the reports, Vincent and Claudia were thrilled with her new choice, and the relationship was moving quickly toward engagement. I felt nothing but relief when I heard this news. Isabella had found someone from her social class who could provide the lifestyle she wanted, and I'd avoided spending my life trying to earn the approval of people whose values I fundamentally disagreed with. The engagement ring, according to one friend who'd been at the country club that night, had been professionally cleaned and was now adorning Isabella's finger again, courtesy of her new cardiologist boyfriend. Apparently, the dramatic gesture of dropping it in her champagne had become a funny story they told at dinner parties about her crazy ex-fiancé who couldn't handle her family's success. I didn't mind being the villain in their story. I'd rather be seen as crazy by people who measured worth by wealth than be accepted by people who had no respect for the work I did or the values I lived by. 6 months later, I'm dating someone who understands that saving lives is more valuable than saving money, and she's never once suggested that I need to change careers to be worthy of her love. Some people are worth changing for. Others are worth walking away from, even if it means dropping an engagement ring in a champagne glass to make your point clear. The choice, it turns out, is always yours to make.